The Handkerchief, written by Gr8T78. Harry Potter and the Wizarding World is the sole masterpiece of J.K. Rowling. Chapter 8, Mudbloods, Murmurs, and Mockingbirds. Draco thought that the Christmas halls were going to be a dour affair at Hogwarts Castle. Many of the school's students had left, glad to escape the strange pall over the castle. The Chamber of Secrets scared everyone, Muggle-borns, half-bloods, even pure-bloods alike. The idea of a monstrous beast living below them was no comfort to anyone. Draco had planned to go home for Christmas. His parents usually had a New Year's gala. Pim and the other elves always made a fuss over Draco at Christmas, making his favorite crepes and biscuits, decorating his suite with charmed icicles that would not melt, building a snow fortress outside in which he and his friends could play. It was a surprise, therefore, when on his weekly flu call with his mother in early December, Narcissa suggested that he stay at Hogwarts this Christmas. "I think you will be happier there, my dragon," she said with a fragile smile. "But I want to come to the gala." "And Theo and Blaze were going to come. Theo is getting a new broom for Christmas and we wanted to try it out. And Pim's snow fortress." Narcissa looked to the side, as though checking that her door was firmly closed and warded. "I know you want to come home, my dragon. And I would love to see you. We all would, of course." She cleared her throat here and took a moment to compose herself before starting again. "Your father is upset about you losing the Quidditch match. He had to take a lot of teasing from Jeremiah Flint and Wendell Crabbe. He is furious that he spent all of that money on those brooms, only for you to lose your Quidditch match against the Potter boy. And he also heard about the duel with Potter. Severus told us that it was a draw, but you know how your father can be. He sees a draw as essentially a loss. I'm so sorry, Draco. I just feel that, with how he behaved this summer, with your grades." Draco did not need a reminder about the Cruciatus curse and the glass. Yes, staying with the horrible conversationalists Vince and Greg at a drafty castle with a monstrous beast locked away deep in the bowels of the ground sounded infinitely better than spending Christmas with his father. Oh, because Draco had been told to stay at Hogwarts for Christmas, he figured he might as well spend his extra time doing a bit of research on the Chamber of Secrets. When the cat had been attacked, Draco and many of the younger boys found it a little bit funny. No one liked Mrs. Norris or Argus Filch, and besides, Dumbledore assured the school that the cat was going to be fine once the Mandrake restorative draft was brewed. When the young Gryffindor who kept trying to take photos of everything was attacked. This seems to fit in with Draco's thought that this heir of Slytherin was attacking Muggle-borns. Then just before Christmas, the Hufflepuff and a ghost were attacked. If anyone had asked, Draco would have called his library research simple curiosity. But he knew that there was an undercurrent of worry. After all, at the start of the year, Draco had done a partner assignment in astronomy with the Hufflepuff, Justin Finch-Fletchley. And while the bloke talked far too much, he seemed like a nice enough fellow. And that was it. He was only worried for Justin, he told himself. Oh, as it turned out, Christmas was not the awful time he had feared. He and the handful of other Slytherins who stayed were allowed the run of the common room. With no classes to disturb them, he and Greg and Vince were able to practice Quidditch, play gobstones or exploding snap, listen to music at full volume, sled down the stairs to the dungeon, and draw penises all over the blackboards in several classrooms. Plus, the Hogwarts elves also took food requests when it was only a small handful of students. So he was still able to get his favorite speculoos crepes and Christmas biscuits. Christmas night found Draco lounging in the common room, reading a book that he had checked out of the library after seeing Hermione reading it. It was interesting, the story of a young girl and her brother and their friend in some place he had never heard of called Alabama. Their father was a barrister of sorts. There was a man who had been arrested for attacking a woman, and the father was representing him. The girl and her brother and their friend were determined to pester one of their neighbors who wanted to be left alone. Draco was reminded of Hermione and her two nitwit hangers-on. His fingers dug into the box of chocolates that his mother and father had sent, his favorite ones from Paris. Also in the package had been an envelope, sealed in wax and stamped with his father's signet ring. For a surprised moment, Draco had thought that it was a Christmas card from his father, but instead it had been a newspaper article from the Daily Prophet. It had been quite funny, and Draco decided that he wanted to show it to Vince and Greg. He stretched and looked up, noticing how empty the common room was. Where had those two gotten off to? Probably still gorging themselves senseless in the great hall. Truth, the food had been nice. It was a small crowd of people, and Draco had spent more time than he would admit looking furtively at Hermione in the candlelight. They had never shared a meal before, though he had seen her eat many times. It was a nice change, he thought, being only across the table from her instead of across the entire great hall. He got up and walked out of the Slytherins' common room, looking left and right. No sign of Vince or Greg. Then he started towards the stairs that led back up to the entrance hall. Seriously, the elves would just need to shut down the kitchen to make those two leave. As he rounded the corner, he was surprised to see the two Slytherin boys in conversation with a Weasley. What was he doing down here? Draco drew closer. There you are. Have you two been pigging out in the Great Hall all this time? I've been looking for you. I want to show you something really funny. He looked at the Weasley wizard. And what are you doing down here, Weasley? You want to show a bit more respect to a school prefect. I don't like your attitude. The Weasley's face was turning redder than his hair. Draco rolled his eyes and stalked off down the hall, back towards the Slytherin common room. That Peter Weasley, he started to the others behind him. Percy, interrupted Vince. Whatever. I've noticed him sneaking around a lot lately. And I bet I know what he's up to. He thinks he's going to catch Slytherin's heir single-handed. Draco laughed as they reached the hidden entrance to the common room. What's the new password again? Oh, yeah, pureblood. Privately, Draco thought that as passwords go, this one wasn't very secure or terribly original, but nobody asked second years anything. Draco showed them the article from the Daily Prophet in which Arthur Weasley had been investigated and fined for bewitching a muggle car. The story of how Potter and the Weasel had gotten to school had made the rounds that fall. It was amusing to him to see how it had all ended. Vince and Greg, never ones to really get the nuance of things, laughed half-heartedly. Merlin, it really sucked having stupid friends. He wished that Blaise and Theo had stayed behind for the Christmas halls instead. What's up with you, Crabbe? Draco asked, as the boy had started to look as though he were going to throw up. Stomachache, Vince said. Well, go up to the hospital wing and give all those mudbloods a kick from me, he laughed. In his mind, he remembered his mother saying that Wendell Crabbe had told his father all about losing the Quidditch match. Clearly, Vince was willing to share details about Draco with his father. It would bolster his reputation if he made fun of the Muggleborns and Professor Dumbledore. You know, I'm surprised the Daily Prophet hasn't reported all these attacks yet. I suppose Dumbledore's trying to hush it all up. He'll be sacked if it doesn't stop soon. Father's always said old Dumbledore's the worst thing that's ever happened to this place. He loves Muggleborns. A decent headmaster would never have let slime like that creepy Inches Potter. Can I have your picture, Potter? Can I have your autograph? Can I lick your shoes, please, Potter? Greg and Vince just stared at him stupidly. What's the matter with you two? They finally laughed. For Salazar's sake, what the hell was in their Christmas pudding? Was there a potion that made you stupider? St. Potter, the Mudblood's friend, Draco continued. Once he had started talking, he found it difficult to find a stopping point. He's another one with no proper wizard feeling, or he wouldn't go around with that jumped-up Granger Mudblood. He coughed slightly at his own words. And people think he's Slytherin's heir. Draco scoffed to himself because he counted himself as one of those people. In his estimation, being a Parselmouth was pretty damning. No one really knew much about Harry Potter, other than the stuff in legend. Who was to say he wasn't descended from Slytherin? Both boys just sat there dumbly, mouths hanging open. It really was like talking to a wall, he thought. But clearly sometimes the wall had ears if Vince was going to run to his father and report everything about Draco. Then Draco would give him something to talk about. I wish I knew who it is. I could help them. Okay, perhaps now he was laying on too thick. Yet, Vince looked almost surprised, so Draco took that as a good sign. Seriously, did the dolt really think that a 12-year-old would be able to help an ancient magical beast? Gods, these two really were stupid. Greg cleared his throat and looked over weirdly at Vince. You must have some idea who's behind it all. Draco rolled his eyes. You know I haven't, Goyle. How many times do I have to tell you? And Father won't tell me anything about the last time the chamber was opened either. Of course, it was 50 years ago, so it was before his time, but he knows all about it, and he says that it was all kept quiet, and it'll look suspicious if I know too much about it. In truth, his father had given him hardly any information. Lucius had only said that it had happened in recent history, so in his library research, Draco had cross-referenced Muggle-born deaths at Hogwarts reported in the Daily Prophet. The only one to have happened in the last 100 years was 50 years ago, and it had been a very mysterious death. But I know one thing: last time the Chamber of Secrets was opened, a mudblood died. So I bet it's a matter of time before one of them's killed this time. I hope it's Granger. The thought turned his stomach, his Christmas dinner threatening to come back up for another visit when he'd said it. After he'd spoken, he quickly looked away, afraid that the boys might see the actual truth written on his face. But they were staring at each other, clearly trying to keep up with the conversation. Draco had a feeling that this was the most anyone had spoken to either of them in days. The two of them blathered on a while longer, and Draco lost the thread of the conversation. To be honest, he was ready to get back to his book, which was far more interesting to him than this conversation. He looked a bit longingly at the book, which was across the room at the chair in front of the fireplace. When he finally turned back to face them again, they were rushing out at the room, sick from all of the extra pudding at Christmas dinner. No surprise that those two would eat anything that stood still long enough. Oh. To keep his mind busy and not dwell on his guilt over what he had said about Hermione to Vince and Greg, Draco found himself in the library several nights a week that winter and spring. When the rest of Slytherin House was occupied with gobstones or chess or swapping gossip over butterbeer, his Quidditch playing had improved significantly, but they only practiced a few nights a week, which left him plenty of time for research. He worked on his schoolwork, of course, certain that this would be his year to come out on top of his class. But his curiosity was piqued by this Chamber of Secrets business. He read any books he could find that seemed to have any relevance to it. He reminded himself that it was simply curiosity, the need to solve the riddle. There was no other reason to be overly concerned about it. As a pure blood, no other reason at all. Oh. The library was quiet. It was May and exams revision would be starting soon enough, but today was Saturday, and most students were getting ready to go to the Gryffindor against Hufflepuff Quidditch game. Draco planned to go down after a while, hopefully to watch the Gryffindor team get flattened. But he had awoken thinking again about the Chamber of Secrets, so after breakfast, he found himself in the library once more. Draco was alone, and he liked it this way. Reaching high for a book entitled Creatures of the Dark, he nearly jumped as he heard a loud cha behind him. Turning quickly, he wasn't the least surprised to see her sentient hair swirling over her Gryffindor scarf. Can I help you, Granger, or are you just here to try and scare the living hell out of people? I didn't think Slytherins got scared, Malfoy. Especially of plain old mudbloods. With that hair, you could scare anyone, Granger, he said, but with an almost friendly smile. You would know all about frightful hair, Malfoy. Your hair is glowing so much it looks radioactive. Well, your hair weight, what does that mean? She sighed. Never mind. Just trust me, it was a really good joke. So, what is you so interested in Creatures of the Dark? Are you hung up on the Chamber of Secrets as well? Draco hesitated, then decided that honesty was the best policy, particularly with Hermione. Particularly when they were alone. To a point. Yes, I think it's really fascinating, you know. What kind of creature could possibly be doing it all? I mean, it's one thing to attack a living being, but to take out a ghost, he said, scanning the pages of the first chapter entitled So You Believe That You Are Being Stalked by a Dark Creature. Yes, it is very curious, she agreed. But I doubt that you have much reason for concern though, Malfoy. What with you being a pure blood and everything. Here it was. They were going to talk about it. Draco could feel a clammy sweat break out on his forehead. Granger, about... I don't know what I was thinking. That day last fall on the Quidditch pitch. And the other times. I didn't mean here, he stopped, not sure what to say. He knew that he wanted to say he was sorry, but he was afraid that she would tell everyone in the school. He was fairly certain that he could not live that down if all the Slytherin students found out. "Malfoy, you look sick. Is an apology that difficult to stomach?" she asked, a slight sneer on her face. "I shouldn't have said it. I'm sorry," the words rushed out, taking them both by surprise. She stayed quiet. Traitor that it was, his mouth blustered on, unable to find a stopping point. "My father. He uses that term a lot. I think when you implied that he bought my way on the Slytherin Quidditch team, it just popped in my head. I don't really feel that way. About you, I mean. And honestly, I'd worried that he bought those brooms for that reason as well, you know. But I also know I was the best to try out, and never mind." He exhaled a long sigh. "It's just difficult. Slytherins talk, you know, to each other, to their parents. And the parents talk to each other, too. Apparently, my losing that first Quidditch match to the Gryffindors. Let's just say, my father wasn't pleased when he had to hear all about it from Marcus Flint and Vince Crabbe's fathers. My father expects a lot of me, he expects me to be like him." "And are you?" she asked in a quiet voice. "No. At least I didn't mean to be." Ihur looked up at her, saw her eyes flashing copper, and had to look away. "I don't want to be like him." He took a deep breath. It was much more difficult and simultaneously much easier to admit that than he thought it would be. "That's good." The small curls that had escaped her beret fluttered, and Draco's eyes were pulled there as though by a magnet. Draco smiled, feeling that a massive burden had been lifted from him. "It's just been a crazy year, you know. This whole chamber business, I just wish I could figure out what it is all about. It's the not knowing, you know." Hermione smiled at him with mutual comprehension. He knew if there was anyone who understood that sentiment, it would be her. "So, what kind of creature do you think is in this chamber?" she asked. Draco smiled, thankful that she was willing to make an effort to move past the discomfort of the past several minutes. "Well, I don't think it's just an ordinary beast. After all, it is the heir of Slytherin. It would make sense that it is a snake, but where is it? Why has no one seen it or heard it?" He reasoned. Well, Hermione bit her lip and looked to the side in a shifty sort of way. "What, you've seen a snake wandering the corridor and haven't said anything?" Draco asked drolly. "No, I haven't seen anything. Or heard anything, at least not myself. But I've just had the thought that it could be a snake too. Harry. Well, do you remember that business at the dueling club, with the snake?" He nodded his assent, afraid that opening his mouth might give away his feelings about that night. How could he forget? Professor Snape had tried to play a cruel trick on Potter, but it was nearly as big a fright to Draco. Seeing a giant snake emerge from his wand that way. Then, to top it off, the snake seemed to be rearing up and attacking. Only the fear of ridicule and of being eaten by a conjured snake kept Draco's feet on the ground and not running for the exit. Then when Potter seemed to be talking to it. That had been especially creepy. Hermione continued. "So, Harry has been hearing things. Sinister-sounding things, and no one else can hear them. He just heard it, in fact." So Draco had been right. Potter was a Parsamouth. Are you sure he's not just mental? Draco smiled. Enough time had passed this winter and spring that Draco didn't really suspect Potter anymore of being the heir of Slytherin. If he were, he was sure that the smartest Muggle-born in the school would have either been attacked or would have figured it out long ago. Hermione huffed an exasperated sigh. "I'm sure he's not mental. So yes, a snake would make sense, but how?" He said the first time he heard it, he was in the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom. And the second time was in the corridor where Mrs. Norris was found. And just now, he was outside the Great Hall. All of those places are far apart, on different levels of the castle. How could a snake be moving around like that and no one see? Even if it were invisible, someone would bump into it. It's almost as though it was living in the walls of the castle. Draco shuffled through his stack of books, finding a slim journal entitled Daily Prophet Excerpts, 1943. What if it's not the walls? Look at this. I did a referencing charm for news articles about unusual Muggle-born deaths over the years at Hogwarts. There were a few during tournaments and some others during Quidditch matches. Then there were a couple of duels gone awry, but this one stuck out to me. Turns out, there was a girl killed in the school in 1943. She was Muggle-born, and it was the only death that year. There weren't many details. Probably the headmaster didn't want a lot of information out there, especially if it had something to do with this Chamber of Secrets. But look, he found the page he was looking for, and passed it to her so that Hermione could see the grainy black and white photo of the young girl with pigtails and glasses. It says she was found dead in a lavatory. What if? In his excitement, he had absent-mindedly scratched the word pipes on the corner of the page of the book in front of him. The book that discussed his most likely creature suspect. He tore the part of the page that described the creature out of the book and, with a knowing smirk, turned it so that she could see it, brandishing it like a trophy. Malfoy! You can't go around destroying school property. Hermione was so focused on the scandalous act of desecration that she barely spared a glance at the book's page he held aloft. Never mind that reparo. He showed her the ripped book. The page seemed to regrow, ink lines spreading out to reform the missing words. How did you? She began to ask, but he interrupted her impatiently. Granger, I have a very extensive library back home. It has a vast collection of books, and I love speculoos crepes. It was one of the first spells I perfected, he finished with a wicked grin. You're awful, she admonished with her own smile. So it's possibly getting around in the pipes. This makes sense. Moaning Myrtle was found in a girl's lavatory. Sorry, who? Draco asked in confusion. Oh, this. She turned the book of articles from 1943 back to him and pointed at the photo. Is Moaning Myrtle? She's still there. In fact, I should go speak with her now. I'm certain that she saw this. Hermione's eyes swiftly scanned the page torn from Draco's book. Basilisk before she died. In fact, according to this segment about basilisks, that's almost got to be how she died, looking the snake in the eyes. But why did no one die this time? Draco had squeamish thoughts about Justin lying up in the hospital wing. But Hermione continued discussing it without noticing his slightly green expression. Of course, it's because they didn't look the snake in the eyes, she exclaimed. Hermione slapped her hand on the stack of books, causing them to shift. Draco looked back at her. What are you on about now, Granger? He raised one eyebrow at her. She smiled a bit and looked away from him, her copper eyes searching around until they landed back on the books upon the table. No one made direct eye contact with the snake. Colin saw it through his camera. Harry said the film and camera were burned, so it probably took the brunt of the damage. And Mrs. Norris thought while there was a lot of water on the ground that night, maybe she was thirsty and was drinking the water and saw the snake's reflection. And Justin, he probably only saw the basilisk through that ghost. Draco chimed inches. Their eyes met with a fierce current of understanding between them, excitement from a puzzle solved, like multiple Tetris pieces fitting just so. A wall falling away. Liquid silver met molten copper as the two leaned slightly towards each other in excitement. It was Hermione who broke the gaze first, quickly packing up her things. Are you going to see this, Emerald? He asked in excitement. Yes, but I wouldn't advise coming along. She cries a lot and she doesn't seem to like boys. All girls like me, Granger, he responded with a comical leer. Hermione sped up her packing process, looking a little pink in the face, clearly excited at the idea of talking to this Myrtle girl. Well, this one doesn't seem to like anyone, she said with a small smile. But how are you going to go there? Didn't you say Potter heard the snake talking earlier? What if it is roaming around looking for the habit of speaking to his Slytherin friends caused him to nearly slip into his new vernacular? Muggle-borns to kill. I'm sure you're not too worried about me, Malfoy. Didn't you say you hoped that I was next? I never, but Draco cut himself off. He had said that, but not anywhere near Hermione. He just looked her in the eyes, a silent apology passing between them. She huffed loudly and continued. I have a small mirror in my bag. I can use that to look around corners as I go. Her toilet isn't very far from here. She removed a tiny handheld mirror from a pocket of the bag. You call that a mirror? A mirror for a Cornish pixie, maybe. Let's see your mirror then, Malfoy. I'm sure it has to be a pretty big to show you your entire head at one time. Don't hate me because I'm beautiful, Granger. Draco corked a brow at her. Her own brow furrowed. That's from a television advert. Did you watch the telly growing up, Malfoy? She asked in a surprised tone. What's a telly? At her disbelieving expression, he laughed. I'm only joking. I did watch one once. My mother attended an afternoon tea at the home of a woman who was a half-blood. She had a teenage son, and he was in charge of watching me. I was about 6 or 7, and the boy made this little box come to life. It took me about an hour to realize that the people weren't trapped inside of it. I don't remember much about it except that it was fascinating. There was a blonde man and a black man with unusual hair who wore far too many necklaces. They had one of those muggle contraptions with wheels, like the ministry cars, but bigger. It was black if I recall. I think they were looking for things. Maybe solving a crime, like a burglary. Hermione stood stock still. You're telling me that Draco Malfoy has watched the team? She asked in complete disbelief. Yes. That's it. The team. Goodness, I've been trying to remember the name of that for years. So yes, Granger, to answer your inane question, I know all about the Pelly. Telly. It's short for television. Yes, whatever, Granger. He snapped, slightly embarrassed. And you realize of course that there are probably thousands of shows on the telly. That's the team is only one of them. Why yes, of course. Of course I did. He cleared his throat and looked away, even more embarrassed. He had had no idea that the little box did anything other than show those same people in that same scenario over and over again. In his mind, he thought of it as a music box, charmed to play only one tune endlessly. Now his mind went in 1,000 different tangents. Did the same people do other things? Did the people sleep in the telly? Were there other people inside of it? Was it all about burglaries? Did more of them wear necklaces like the man with unusual hair? He shook his head and turned back to Hermione. Granger, I'm serious, that mirror is quite small. Perhaps Draco wasn't sure he could pull off an enlarging charm. It's all right, Malfoy. After all, if you give me your gigantic personal mirror, that will be 2 things I have of yours, she said, pinking a bit as she discreetly pulled out and then tucked in her monogrammed handkerchief into her skirt pocket. People might start to talk. Yes, never mind. Scratch all that. It was Draco's turn to turn slightly pink. I'll let you know tonight after dinner what I find out, she said that she turned to go, holding the mirror in her hand. Yes, good. Draco be gone, but Hermione was gone. It was just as well. He had been about to say be careful, but Hermione knew to do that. As Draco began to straighten the books to go down to the Quidditch pitch to hopefully catch the start of the match, part of him worried that he almost said, be safe. As though by speaking the words, he could will her safety into existence. Chapter 9. Mirrors, Mandrakes, and Middle-of-the-Night Apologies. After Hermione left to speak with Moaning Myrtle, Draco hurried towards the main staircase, eager to get down to the Quidditch pitch to catch the beginning of the match. He had a nervous, excited buzz in his stomach that he could not quite explain. But the rest of the day had been rather bleak. Draco could tell something was wrong almost immediately as he entered the stands of the Quidditch pitch. It had still been rather cool, so he had stopped off in the Slytherin dormitory for his scarf. There, he found a large group of late-starting Slytherins to walk down with, ready to cheer both teams to defeat. They made their way down to the Quidditch pitch as a group, loudly laughing and taking bets on who would get knocked out by a bludger first. It was only a few minutes until the broom mounting when McGonagall entered the pitch and cleared the players off. No one seemed to know what had happened, but the match had been cancelled. Draco went back to the Slytherin common room, where his housemates gathered to play chess or gobstones and speculate about why the match was cancelled. He skipped lunch, instead having a house elf bring him his favorite speculoos crepes. Talking about them earlier with Hermione had made him crave 1 or 3. Now, as the dinner hour began in the Great Hall, it was apparent that something else had happened besides the Quidditch match being cancelled. Another attack. Draco's eyes swiftly cut to the Gryffindor table. Hermione was not there. Neither were Potter and the Weasel, so hopefully the 3 were just off together doing stupid Gryffindor things in their stupid Gryffindor way. It was after dinner, back in the common room, that Draco learned the news. Pansy, Slytherin's own personal news source, shared that Hermione and a Ravenclaw girl, a prefect named Penelope Clearwater, had been petrified. She cackled with unrestrained glee as she shared the story, and Draco felt like punching something. Why has he not insisted on accompanying her? He could have stopped it, could have fought whatever it was off. Oh. A few nights passed, nights in which Draco tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep and stay asleep. He kept replaying moments of conversation he had had with Hermione in the library. What had she meant by, people might start to talk about the two of them together? Surely not. Had it only been a joke? By Thursday, Draco felt as though he had to see her. Thaddeus Locksley was the prefect on patrol tonight, and he often bragged about skiving off of rounds and taking his Hufflepuff sixth-year prefect girlfriend to an empty classroom for some alone time. If he was careful, Draco could make his way to the infirmary room without meeting anyone else in the castle. 20 minutes later he found himself creeping across the room of the infirmary, drawn by the long sweep of brown curls that fell from the edge of a bed near the back. Crossing on quiet feet, Draco moved towards her, stopping just short at the foot of her bed. Granger. Hermione, what happened? Now that he was here, it was hard to find words to say to her. He had heard Professor Flitwick telling Professor Sprout that the petrified students likely could not hear in their current state. Yet he was still moved to speak to her. The way she looked so deathly still like this was frightening, but he could not bring himself to look away. So I suppose we were right. A basilisk, was it? And you had to go ahead and do the bloody Gryffindor thing and save this other bird. Draco gestured to the Ravenclaw prefect on the other bed, trying to force a note of humor into his voice. It was either that or possibly cry, and Merlin knows that he did not want to cry. Were you able to tell anyone before it happened? Likely not, or this wouldn't still be happening. If McGonagall had known that a giant murderous snake was on the loose in Hogwarts, everyone would have been packed and loaded onto the Hogwarts Express within minutes. He wondered briefly if he should tell what they had learned, and to whom. McGonagall was the acting headmistress, but she was likely uninterested in the theories of a second-year Slytherin. After all, 3 in her house were victims, and they had been attacked by the heir of Slytherin. Perhaps Madame Pomfrey. No, she likely had enough on her plate to be getting on with taking care of all of these petrified people as well as the usual student injuries and illnesses. If he'd had his head on straight, he'd have gone to Hagrid to discuss it all long ago. After all, the man knew about creatures. He might have been able to help, but that was impossible now. Draco's own father had seen to that. For most of his second year, Draco had avoided going to visit Hagrid. With all the discussion of purebloods and mudbloods, Draco felt like he had a spotlight on him, and it wouldn't do to be seen visiting Hagrid. If he saw Hagrid in the corridors of the castle, Draco would look down or quickly pretend to be mid-conversation. Draco heaved a sigh, another thing to feel guilty about. Draco turned back to Hermione. Reaching out hesitantly, he touched her hand, surprised to find it warm and soft despite the stiffness of her pose. Curling his fingers around hers, he felt the rough scratch of paper. Excitedly, he tugged a small bit of the piece of paper from her grip, recognizing it at once as the page from Creatures of the Dark that he had written pipes on. He stuffed the page back into her palm, careful this time to leave a small corner of it up so as to be noticed by her next visitor. Shirley Potter and the Weasel came up every day to check on her. It might take them some time, but perhaps they could piece things together. Hermione, I'm so sorry. I should have come with you. Please wake up. He took her hand again, this time holding her wrist gently. It felt unusual, as though there was something more than just her school jumper on it. He stood to get a better look and gently tugged on the triangle of white that poked out from under the knitted gray. It was his handkerchief, no, hers. No, theirs. It was no longer in the pocket where he'd seen her place it when she left the library. At some point between then and being petrified, she'd taken it out. Perhaps she had used it to signal to the Clearwater girl. Or maybe to wipe off smudges from her shockingly tiny mirror. Regardless, Draco felt slightly better. He may not have been in the corridor with her when it happened, but he had been on her mind in some small way. Hermione, he tried again, but he had no more words. He tucked the handkerchief back where he found it, reached his hand up to rest briefly on her chocolate curls, and closed his eyes. Draco was not one to ask favors from a higher power, but if ever there was a night for such things, it was tonight. Oh. When the mandrakes were properly brewed and the petrified people were restored, Draco looked on in careful neutrality with the rest of the Slytherins. Inwardly, he might be dancing a jig, but outside, he was as composed as ever. He surreptitiously watched Hermione as she greeted her fellow Gryffindors, jealous at the small hug she exchanged with Potter. No, not jealous. What a ridiculous idea. He made his eyes move over to Justin to confirm that he, too, was fine. The boys' eyes met briefly, and there was a small nod of greeting and confirmation between them. He looked back at Hermione. She had her hands clasped together in front of her in joy, and as she exclaimed to yet another scarlet-clad well-wisher, he saw her thumb and index finger pull slightly at the cuff of her jumper, withdrawing the white square of fabric. She chanced to look at him and offered the tiniest of smiles. She tucked the handkerchief back indiscreetly. Draco could not explain why his heart began racing suddenly, nor did he wish to think very hard about it. Oh. The leaving feast had been a joyous evening, well, middle of the night, really. It was a celebration for the unpetrified students and for Hagrid's and Dumbledore's returns. Draco realized at some point during the feast that he was sitting amongst his fellow Slytherins, some of whom he liked, many of whom he just kind of tolerated. The Slytherins' applause was half-hearted, sometimes some even jeered quietly. But they were celebrating people whose company he actually enjoyed, but had avoided most of the year. Hermione and Hagrid and even Justin in a way had added happiness to his life when they hadn't needed to. When their happiness was actively threatened by him, even. Draco was glad to have made up with Hermione, but he decided that he'd avoided Hagrid long enough. Oh. Lucius had told the tale to Draco weeks before of how he'd orchestrated Hagrid's stint in Azkaban by threatening the other governors. It was clear at Hagrid's return that he was happy to be home, but haunted by what he'd seen. As the castle settled for a pre-dawn kip at around 4 o'clock in the morning after the feast, Draco tried to lie down to rest as well. But the guilt gnawed at him until he finally got up and slipped out of the castle and into the night. He hurried down the hill to Hagrid's hut as the dawn loomed in the far distance. Hagrid answered the door in high spirits, which were quickly dampened when he spotted Draco. Malfoy. The older man's words were both a statement and a question. I thought I should apologize. For my father's actions. I know being in that place it must have been difficult, and I'm sorry. They looked at each other solemnly for a moment, then Draco turned to go. Hagrid's voice stopped him. You've got nothing to apologize for, Malfoy. Sometimes a parent don't always do right by their kids or by other people. It's not your fault. Draco said nothing, but turned back to give Hagrid a nod of understanding. After a moment, Draco reached out to shake his hand quickly, then patted Fang on his great wide head and made as if to leave again. I nicked a plate of cakes from the Great Hall earlier, if ye haven't anywhere to be. No time yet to be cooking breakfast or anything. You're welcome to join me. Draco smiled timidly and crossed the threshold, sitting and talking more freely than he ever had before with Hagrid. Knowing the long summer away would protect their secret acquaintanceship. They shared cakes and elderflower juice, they talked of creatures, Quidditch, even golf. Draco was surprised to learn that Hagrid's father had nearly been a professional at the sport. Though Hagrid himself didn't play on account of his height. They discussed their favorite magical beasts. Hagrid told Draco that, though he'd never gotten even to OWL level officially, the previous gamekeeper Og as well as old Professor Kettleburn had shared many insights about the various creatures and how to communicate with them. It takes a little effort, but you can really begin to understand them after a time. And I like to think they understand me and all as well, Hagrid said to him, beaming with pride. Neither of them particularly cared one way or the other about unicorns, despite both their wand cores containing unicorn hair. Both had a strong affinity for dragons, of course. Hagrid also liked the Strells and Acromantula, much to Draco's horror. And Hagrid seemed pleasantly surprised to hear all about Starklaw. Ye like hippogriffs, Yes, they're so unusual. I think they're amazing. Ye ought to take magical creatures next year. Professor Kettleburn and me have been raising all sorts of creatures you'd enjoy, Hagrid said with a knowing smile. Oh. The train ride home was relaxing. It was a beautiful summer day to unwind, play games, and enjoy a pile of cauldron cakes and chocolate frogs. Draco stood and stretched, then headed out of the door to the toilets down the train. In the corridor, he met Hermione and couldn't stop himself from grinning widely at her. "So, Malfoy, it turned out that my pixie mirror was plenty big enough. I didn't need your giant mirror after all," she giggled. "That's good, because I think Lockhart nicked it when he left," Draco joked, and though she tried to look stern, Draco could see the laughter in her copper eyes. "So I take it Scarface and the Weasel solved the mystery about the chamber." "Yes, they came to the same conclusions we did," she said. Though Draco could not help but notice it seemed to have taken them more time than it did him and Hermione. "Good. Although if those wankers keep sodding off and earning a boatload of points at the end of every year, they're going to find themselves locked in a chamber at some point. First that Philosopher's Stone business, now this," Draco joked. Hermione looked shocked. "How did you know about the Philosopher's Stone? That bit was never revealed to the students." "I know everything, Granger. Besides, who do you think pointed you to that book with Nicholas Flamel in it?" His silver eyes glittered, pleased as she flushed brightly. "I am sure I don't know what you mean, Malfoy." "Oh. By the way, since you asked so nicely, how did you put it?" "Yes, I did do the bloody Gryffindor thing and saved that other bird," Hermione smirked. Draco's eyes widened. It was his turn to be surprised. So much for petrified people not being able to hear their visitors. "What did you do? Give her a lecture right there in the corridor, Granger?" He quirked an eyebrow at her. "No, I waved her down with this." Hermione touched her cuff lightly. "So thank you for that from both of us, I guess. It really is true, you never know when you might need one." "Right, Granger." He smiled at her. "Well, have a good summer. See you in September." Oh. Draco's second summer home from Hogwarts was better than his last one. His father remained in an ill temper for the duration of summer, as he had been removed from the Hogwarts Board of Governors for actions unbecoming of a board member. He also appeared to be at a loss about the elf staff, becoming agitated when he called for one of them. Draco had learned his lesson not to discuss Potter or Hermione with his father, instead occasionally bringing them up along with his fellow Slytherins to his mother. When grades arrived, Draco was pleased to learn that not having final examinations meant that there were no class rankings, so his high marks were able to stand by themselves. But the best part of the summer was the knowledge that somewhere, a witch carried a reminder of him around with her, tucked inside of her sleeve. Oh. Chapter 10. Can't get you off my mind all this late night talking. Something was off about this witch. Draco could not put his finger on exactly what it was, but things were not right. It was early September, and school had been back in session for less than a week, yet Draco seemed to see Hermione everywhere. One moment, she was rushing down the hall towards the Muggle Studies classroom. The next moment, he thought he caught a glimpse of her hair hurrying down the dungeon's staircase towards Potions class. At the meals at which he saw her, she seemed to be a blur of motion, trying to eat as quickly as possible. As someone who had spent an inordinate amount of time studying Hermione Granger, Draco could tell that something was different, though he reasoned that perhaps it was just that he was watching her if possible even more than usual. He had resigned himself to the fact that he was watching her, and not just because he hoped to best her in class, or because he planned to make fun of her swotness, or to see what inane Gryffindor nonsense she and Potter and the Weasel would get up to. He finally had to admit to himself that he was watching her because she was interesting to watch. He rather enjoyed it. Oh. Truly, a lot was different this year at Hogwarts, and not just Hermione. The Dementors had shown up on the train and had never gone away. Draco found them horribly creepy and all around god-awful. His guilt and shame at his father's role in sending Hagrid to Azkaban returned anew after his first encounter with the Dementors on the train. Being around these creatures was very much no joke, and Draco wasn't sure he could handle more than a few minutes at a time being around them. He took the piss out on Potter for collapsing, but after reliving his own mother's wails, his furious father's sinister bellow, and his own piteous cries for mercy during the Cruciatus curse this summer, he wasn't in the best shape either. Potter had had an eventful summer, what with violating the statute of secrecy and the rules on underage magic. And yet, for all of his room breaking, for his punishment he had gotten a free stay in Diagon Alley. This actually was not all that different than previous years, thought Draco. The Git lived a charmed life. Weasley's family had won a small pile of gold and had promptly squandered it, which was entirely unsurprising to Draco. The eldest one at Hogwarts, Percy according to Vince, was now head boy. So Draco made a mental note to start coming up with his insults for the Slytherin common room while they were all still on platform 9 3/4. Blaise had taken Theo and two Muggle girls to see something he called Jurassic Park that summer. Whatever they had seen this park on sounded a lot like a telly, only far bigger. Blaise tried to explain that there was a story about large dragon-like creatures. But Theo only wanted to talk about how the Muggle girls had gotten so scared that the one with him had jumped into his lap and had seemed to enjoy snogging. Draco and the rest of the Slytherin Quidditch team threw themselves into training almost immediately. Marcus had researched ways to bulk up over the summer, so they were expected to climb stairs, do aerobic exercises, and lift heavy weights every day before breakfast. Within weeks, Draco could see a small difference, so while the rest of the team complained, he kept his mouth shut and appreciated the benefits. Vince and Greg had grown slightly wider over the summer. Tracy and Pansy and several of the other girls had grown boobs, but none were as big as Vince's. Oh, all of the news outlets were focused on Draco's deranged cousin who had escaped from Azkaban. Because the man had been in prison since Draco was a baby, he had never known him. But everyone in the Slytherin common room clamored for information, as though he and Sirius had summered on the Amalfi Coast together during his childhood. He had long ago exhausted every tiny scrap of knowledge he had that his grandfather Cygnus and Sirius's mother Walburga were close siblings, carrying on the proud black family heritage after their brother Alfred had turned against their pure-blood ways. From the few stories that Narcissa had shared about her father, Cygnus sounded like a bit of an arse, but next to his sister Walburga, he was a total saint. Draco recalled as a very young child going to visit great Aunt Walburga in her old age. The house had been musty and frankly frightening. There had been a coat rack that seemed to grab your cloaks before you'd even had a chance to finish taking them off. Dishes and little figurines and trinkets appeared to rattle inside dusty old china cabinets. There had been a row of house elf heads nailed to the wall, and Draco wondered what they possibly could have done so wrong as to earn that horrifying punishment. Walburga had been quite senile, content to whisper and occasionally yell about her useless son who had abandoned her, and her beautiful boy who had made everyone proud. Occasionally, she threw wide her cracked white lips and yellow teeth to bellow loudly for the house elf. This sorry creature looked, if possible, even more ancient than Draco's great-aunt. His grayish skin was paper-thin, and his bloodshot eyes were red-rimmed as he bowed and scraped to his mistress, bringing a polished silver tea service. Because Walburga had forgotten that she had already asked for tea 3 times before. Every available surface in the room now contained a piping hot silver tea service. This annoyed Draco because he had brought his sketchbook and brightly colored pencils with him, hoping to pass the time with drawing, for which he preferred to sit at a table. The alternative now was to try not to stare in open fascination and disgust at Walburga, who apparently had forgotten that she must close her mouth after she drank, resulting in a near-constant dribble of brown tea down the front of her pink dress robes. Narcissa had had to remind him more than once not to stare at the frightening sight. Draco had not shared all of these disturbingly awful details with the rest of Slytherin House. He had only said that Sirius had been thought to be working for the other side, but was apparently a double agent who actually worked for the Dark Lord. Sirius had apparently given up Potter's parents after having won their trust. This information came not from Narcissa, who preferred not to involve herself in discussions of such dealings, but from Lucius. Lucius did not hold many members of the Black family in high regard, thinking them generally soft. What with Narcissa's relatives who had disgraced the family, others who had landed themselves in Azkaban after the Dark Lord had fallen, and Sirius and Alfred's apparent treachery in going over to the other side, it was clear that Lucius did not fully subscribe to the Sirius as double agent idea. But he gleefully shared the handful of details he knew with Draco, who in turn shared them with his closest allies in Slytherin House. The Potter family had entrusted Sirius as the baby Potter's godfather, and then he had gotten the parents killed by the Dark Lord. He'd also killed one of their best friends and a whole street full of muggles to boot. To be entirely honest, Black sounded as insane as Lord Voldemort to Draco, and he was glad to not know him. It was assumed by most that Potter knew the entire truth about Black, yet when he brought up the subject with the bespectacled boy in class one day, Potter seemed clueless as always. Oh, Draco was taking additional courses this year, as all third years were. He shared arithmancy and ancient ruins with Hermione, enjoying the chance to see her away from her knuckle-headed duo for a change. He was surprised to see her doing poorly in divination, but as the weird Professor Trelawney noted, it was not a subject learned in books. And if there was one thing that Hermione Granger did, it was learned from books. Their occasional meetings in the library resumed within a few days of school commencing, at times slyly sneaking to each other's table to steal away a needed text for their shared classes with a smirk and a pointed look. When Draco was stuck on a particularly difficult rune translation, he asked her for help, and they sat together side by side poring over the textbook for a glorious 20 minutes or so, during which Draco counted how many times their knees touched 8, how many times their hands touched 16, and how many freckles she had on her right cheek 11. He paid closer attention to Hermione now. He noticed that when he absent-mindedly swept a hand through his platinum blonde hair, her eyes would often follow it. He saw that when he pointed out an item in the book, her eyes would follow his hands carefully. He noticed that when he ate a spearmint toad, she would lean into him more. He noted that when he made a little joke, she would giggle, sometimes covering her mouth with her hand. If he said something funny or rude about one of her precious Gryffindors, she would grow stern, sometimes angry, and her hair would seem to spark at the corners of his vision. He made an effort to do all of these things around her. He yelled the honeydew shop for a large canister of spearmint toads that Thorn struggled to carry. He started carding his fingers through his hair so much that it required washing twice daily. He read the text ahead to search for things to point out to her. And as he walked the corridors of the school, he thought of jokes and quips that would get some reaction, any kind of reaction from her. Oh, one class he certainly was not enjoying was Care of Magical Creatures. This was upsetting because it was the class that Draco had looked forward to the most this year. In his younger years, he had obsessed over dragons and thunderbirds like most boys, of course. And he had always loved walking out to the paddock behind Knot Manor and visiting the creatures therein. Pym's cousin Eustace worked there, and the 4 of them, the 2 boys and the 2 house elves, would brush the shiny unicorn coats and polish the saddles for the Abraxan horses for hours. Pym and Eustace would share funny stories about their families, occasionally singing elf kitchen songs in harmony. But by far his favorite magical creature was the one they started the school year studying in the Care of Magical Creatures class, and it had gone so sideways that Draco wasn't sure it would ever get back on track. Growing up, he had been fascinated with the hippogriffs in fairy tales and magical storybooks. Narcissa, who has many useful contacts in the wizarding world, had located a magical circus in the outskirts of Bruges, Belgium when he was 6, too young for the back-to-back side-along apparitions that it would take to reach Belgium. He and Narcissa had flew to the Standard Hotel near to King's Cross, then they boarded a Muggle train for Dover. From there, they took a boat across the Strait of Dover to Bruges, then Narcissa did a quick side-along apparition with him to the wizarding circus. Narcissa introduced him to Igvard, the gamekeeper of the circus. They had stopped to look at all of the animals, Draco taking a moment to admire the almost crystalline nature of the demiguise's fur. To furrow his brow in confusion at the empty cage marked the strowl, until finally they had reached the hippogriff, Starclaw. The black and white dappled creature stood majestically in a corner of the tent. Igvard moved forward gently, holding Draco's hand, speaking in low, hushed tones to the hippogriff. Draco could not take his eyes off of the creature, and they stared at each other for what seemed like hours. Reaching up, he ran his fingers through the feathers on the hippogriff's neck, and the hippogriff leaned his neck into Draco's touch with what Draco recognized was happiness. Narcissa had bought him a fricadelle and fries with mayonnaise, and they'd watched the magical circus from the top box, marveling at the amazing acrobats and dancers, oohing and awing as the animals became part of the spectacular show. At the end, Narcissa had purchased him a stuffed replica of the hippogriff, which he carried home proudly that night, naming it Carlton because that's what he thought Igvard had said the creature's name was when they were first introduced. And Draco found this very funny. Now, as the first class with Hagrid began, the group was face to face with several large hippogriffs. Draco stared in awe, not realizing how many different colors they could be, how beautiful they could be all together. He thought of Starclaw and of how different his feathers and coat had been compared to these creatures. One in particular in the front looked as though Starclaw had been caught in a magical rain that had washed away all of the dark spots in his fur, leaving behind the pristine white. In Magical Creatures, Hagrid asked for volunteers to greet the hippogriffs, and Draco hung back, not wanting to seem overly eager. But when Potter volunteered, He was annoyed with himself for missing the chance. As Hagrid prattled on about the creatures that Draco already knew so well, his mind wandered back to Starclaw. Was he still in the circus? Had he seen all kinds of magical places? Igvard had said that the circus toured all over the continent, and that the following year they would go to America to tour. Draco silently marveled at the places that Starclaw had likely seen. Potter was now climbing on the back of the beautiful white hippogriff, and Draco's jealousy burned. Not only was Potter getting to ride the creature, a prize that Draco had not even realized was in a mix of possibilities, but it was the white one. The one he hoped to study. Once Potter and the hippogriff came back, the rest of the crowd surged forward, eager to have a chance with the majestic creatures. Draco, followed by Vince and Greg, sauntered up just as Potter was dismounting and walking away on shaky legs. Draco caught the very end of Hagrid's warning to approach the creatures with caution. Starclaw had been such a sweet-tempered and gentle creature, Draco had been able to tell by looking in his eyes. As he approached this hippogriff, however, they locked eyes and Draco could see that this one was different. There was a haughty, almost austere gleam in the beady black eyes. "I'll bet you're not dangerous at all, are you, you big ugly brute?" Draco had meant it in a teasing way, but apparently this creature did not take well to teasing. It had reared back, striking Draco in the arm with its sharp talons, causing him to fall back into the dirt. His arm felt like it was on fire from the cut, and he could not help but scream out. The next few moments were a blur, as Draco felt himself bodily lifted from the ground, then being carried clumsily up the hill back towards the castle. Voices followed him. He recognized Goyle and Pansy, and closer than them, Hermione. She appeared to be keeping pace with Hagrid, who was apparently carrying Draco. She was offering directions to Hagrid. "Try to keep his arm steady. I'll walk ahead and open the door for you. Take the back staircase because there are fewer stairs up to the hospital wing." Draco closed his eyes, allowing the rolling bounce of the oaf skate to try and override the pain in his arm. After what seemed like only a few moments, he was deposited onto a cool bed, and Hagrid hurried away to find Madame Pomfrey. Draco opened his eyes to find the sun blocked by a hazy, golden-lit cloud of curls. Hermione had pulled up a chair close to his bed and appeared to be pressing his forearm between her hands. Draco chanced to look down to see how bad the damage was, and was only a little bit surprised to see a bit of white cloth sticking out between her palm and his forearm. "A handkerchief can be a handy thing, right, Malfoy?" she said with a watery grin. Draco glanced up, surprised to see small tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. His sense of bravado overcame his feeling of pain. "Worried about me, Granger?" He tried a lopsided smirk, which turned into a wince as his forearm muscles flexed. "Yes, you prat. What were you thinking, insulting that hippogriff?" She blew a stream of breath upward, causing the curls to flutter, then resettle out of her eyes for a moment. "I thought that we were safe. This was a class after all." He looked down then, his head suddenly flooded with memories. "Besides, the one hippogriff I knew before wasn't like that. He would have never done that." Hermione gave a wry smile, then had to move suddenly to make way for Madame Pomfrey and Hagrid as they bustled back over, laden with bandages and potions. Hermione withdrew the white handkerchief, folding it so that the spots of blood weren't visible. She backed away slowly, making her way to the door. As she leaned against it, ready to leave, she looked back up and met his eyes. "Get better," she mouthed. Draco smirked and threw his good arm over his forehead as though reeling from intense pain, which, come to think of it, wasn't that far from the actual truth. He had no idea what was in hippogriff talons, but it was certainly not all sunshine and rainbows. His entire arm up to the shoulder felt like it was on fire. When he glanced back at the door, she was gone, and he was able to drop the facade, now groaning in real pain. Oh. Draco had immensely enjoyed his return to classes after the hippogriff attack, forcing Weasley and Potter to do the meticulous handiwork required for the shrinking solution in potions class. In truth, his arm did still hurt slightly, and he had been told not to use it much by Pomfrey so that the venom wouldn't spread. But he likely could have done the work himself. But it did give him a chance to watch Hermione as she struggled to finish her own and Neville's solution properly. After class, the moronic duo set off to the door of the classroom, muttering to each other angrily. Draco took an extra moment in packing up with his one good arm, noticing that Hermione was likewise fallen behind her friends to pack her multitudinous books and journals away as well. Why the hell was she carrying all of this? And had the witch never heard of a featherweight charm? As she went to exit the potions classroom, Draco caught up to her, reaching her just as they passed a small recessed alcove, covered by a thin tapestry. Granger, he muttered quietly, though apparently he has still startled her with his closeness. She turned, wide-eyed, and was suddenly pushing against him, backing him into the alcove. What? Just wanted a bit of privacy. Feeling a bit better, Malfoy? She asked with a knowing smirk. I noticed your solution was just the right shade of green. I'm sure in no small part to those perfectly cut daisy roots of Ron's. That tosser was trying to sabotage me. Draco burst out defensively. Hermione chuckled but didn't deny it. And your handkerchief, Granger, were you able to salvage it? I'm sure your cleaning spells were adequate. I preferred to clean it the Muggle way, she answered, lowering her eyes and drawing the small white square from her cuff. It may not have come out pristinely white, but it's clean. I find that Scourgify doesn't get everything off. You could also try Turja, he offered, and immediately wondered what the hell he was doing. Exchanging cleaning tips with Hermione Granger in a darkened alcove. He knew the older boys in Slytherin would tease him mercilessly that he took a witch into an alcove to discuss the proper way to clean something. I don't know, it's kind of fun to leave a bit of a stain sometimes, you know. It kind of reminds you of what happened to get the stain, like a memory. She gave a half smile and lifted her eyes to look into his. Was she saying that she wanted to be reminded of a memory with him in it? Draco's breath caught in his chest. How's your arm? Without warning, Hermione reached out to touch his arm. The sensation was of immediate sparking, like 100 tiny bolts of lightning traveling from his fingertips to his shoulder and down his spine. He shivered slightly. Are you okay? She asked quizzically, pulling back her hand uncertainly. Yes. Fine. I mean, I'm fine. My arm is not, it still hurts a little. Madame Pomfrey says to rest it. His voice trailed off, but he proffered his arm to her to inspect, wondering what that sensation had meant and if it would happen again. But she put her hands on the strap of her backpack instead, smiling at him briefly. That's good, and hopefully you have learned your lesson. Yes. Don't go messing with the wrong sort. Draco smirked, his eyes mirthful, teasing. Yes, well, you certainly don't want to be seen hanging around with the wrong sort, do you, Draco? Draco had never heard his first name spoken by her voice before, and the lightning bolts returned, followed closely by a cold chill of understanding. No, Granger I didn't, but she had turned on her heel, pushing quickly through the tapestry to leave him alone in the alcove. He reached after to her with his injured arm, not thinking, hoping to pull her back into the alcove with him. To make her understand that that wasn't what he meant by the comment. His hand did not find her shoulder, instead closing around the edge of her nearly full to bursting backpack. He grasped it briefly, feeling a small give as a few of the seams ripped, and then the bag was no longer in his fingertips. His arm ached dully, confirming that he really shouldn't have done that. He poked his head from behind the tapestry, but found nothing there. It was as if Hermione had disappeared into thin air. Oh. The following weekend was Halloween. Draco set off to Hogsmeade Village, happy to be out of the castle and into the crisp fall air. He walked leisurely with Theo and Blaise, his eyes cutting occasionally over to Hermione and the Weasel, who walked together in close conversation. Were they talking about him? Did she like Weasley? Like as a boy? Surely not, his mind scoffed back at him. What could she possibly see in the Weasel? He was poor, not very smart, a ginger, not a good flyer. Draco had more money than Merlin, his grades were nearly best in class, his hair was a superb color, and he was an excellent flyer. There was no way the Weasel could compare. He frowned to himself. Wait, why did he care if his hair was better than Weasley's? He shook his head slightly as if to clear it. Draco and the others spent the day gorging on sweets and honeydukes and butterbeer at the Three Broomsticks. They tried out different jokes and trick items in Zonkos, then spent an hour putting and chipping on the charmed green of the truly old course of St. Andrews, which predated the Muggles' old course by a century at least. Oh. After a full day of jocularity and a delicious feast back at the castle, Draco thought of nothing more than turning in for a long night's rest. The older students were just getting started with their party, sipping butterbeers, fire whiskey, and spiced vodka, when the party atmosphere was broken by the clanging of the Bloody Baron's ghostly chains. There has been an incident. Everyone please return to the Great Hall. The silvery face of the Baron gave away nothing. He remained solemn and stoic as always as he disappeared through the wall of the common room. That guy really is creepy, Blaze commented. I mean, I know he fits the aesthetic, the whole gloomy dungeon vibe we have down here. But truly, could they not assign us someone with a little more enthusiasm for life? Hard to have enthusiasm for life when you're dead, I guess, quipped Theo. Yeah, I get the sense that he didn't have a whole lot of appreciation for the living even when he was alive, considering how much blood he has on him. I highly doubt that it's all his, Draco added ominously. The Slytherins made their way slowly back to the Great Hall, whispering and wondering as they noticed the rest of the houses converging inside as well. It soon became apparent that there was an intruder, possibly Sirius Black, based on the gossip moving across the hall. Dumbledore cleared the tables away, explaining that everyone would need to spend the night here under the watchful eyes of the professors and prefects. Draco grumbled along with the rest of the Slytherins, but inside, he felt like a bubble was about to burst in his chest. He had spotted Hermione across the room with the rest of the Gryffindors, and he surreptitiously gestured to his friends with a slight tilt of his head in the direction of the Leyen trio. I want to hear what's going on, and I'm sure it involves Potter because of the whole Godfather thing, Draco explained. Theo followed along gamely, but it was hard to miss the knowing look in Blaze's eyes. Draco ignored this. What the hell did Blaze think he knew, anyway? They settled a row down and away from Hermione, who was a row away from the idiot Potty and the Weasel. One by one, everyone around them seemed to drop off into sleep. Draco dozed as well, though he willed himself not to. He was determined to set things straight between himself and Hermione, and they didn't get many chances to speak, considering who her friends were. He awoke to catch the end of a quiet conversation between Professor Dumbledore and Professor Snape. With that older Weasley prat nearby trying to butt inches, he rolled his eyes, only to find Hermione's eyes narrowed on him. He's such a know-it-all, Draco mouthed to her, grinning. She narrowed her eyes even more, but seemed to smile in spite of herself. A few long minutes passed, and Draco caught the light snores of the Weasel, as well as the steady deep sleeping breaths of Potter behind Hermione. He lifted his head as discreetly as he could to see if she was still awake. At the movement, her eyes popped open as if she'd been waiting for it. I wanted to apologize. For the other day, I didn't mean to make you think that I meant you as the wrong sort. He exhaled dejectedly. But I am, aren't I? A mudblood, not fit to be respected. Dirt beneath your shoes. Her whisper was scathing. No, you're not. Not dirt, I mean. You're. Draco could feel his face heating. He didn't know how to finish this sentence. Quiet, please. The admonishing whisper of the older Weasley boy cut across the room, and Draco lowered his head, pretending to be asleep. After an agonizing 5 minutes, he slowly lifted his head again, but this time, Granger's copper eyes were lidded, her slow, even breaths causing her body to rise and fall in sleep. Percy the prefect had wandered back across the room, and everyone around was asleep. Draco leaned towards her sleeping bag, stopping about 2 feet from her ear. You're perfect, he whispered, finished his earlier sentence, certain that she wouldn't hear it in her slumber. Draco moved back to his own sleeping bag, turning over to stare up at the cloudless charmed sky of the ceiling above him. She was perfect, that's all there was to it. Her mind, her face, her laugh, even her insane hair. Why did things need to be so very difficult? He knew that, regardless of how he felt about Hermione, the rest of his family would certainly see her as dirt. Not that he had any plans in the foreseeable future to have her and them in the same room at the same time. The very idea seemed preposterous now that he thought of it. He sighed, closing his eyes. It really didn't matter. The chances of Hermione and his family interacting were slim to none anyway, thank Merlin. The next morning, Draco was one of the first to wake. He was greeted by a surprising sight in the night. Hermione had worked the white handkerchief free from her jumper sleeve, pressing it to her cheek, sandwiching it between her face and hand. Her other hand reached off of her sleeping bag, in his direction. He was sure the reaching hand was a coincidence. There was no way she'd been reaching for him in her sleep, but it would be hard for her to deny cuddling his handkerchief to her cheek. As he sat up and stretched, he saw her eyes stir behind their lids without opening, then slowly run the handkerchief down the side of her neck, stretching the stiffness out of her shoulder and neck. A small smile touched her lips before her eyes quickly popped open, as though suddenly hyper-aware that she was in a public space, not her own bed. He gasped as she looked around wildly, her hair growing even bushier as she did, and tucked the white handkerchief roughly back into her sleeve. Out of sight. A trickle of realization dawned. Did she possibly sleep with the handkerchief against her cheek sometimes, like a favorite blanket or stuffed creature? Surely not. And yet, as their eyes met and Hermione's face turned a deep red, Draco had to wonder if he'd gotten it right in one. They both looked away quickly, but not before exchanging the smallest of smiles. Chapter 11. Ain't That a Slap in the Face? After the Christmas break, everyone in the school seemed to notice that Potter and Weasley were angry at Hermione. It wasn't clear why to Draco, but he was sure it was the Wonderwanker's faults. The result was that he found her in the library nearly every time he entered it. A feature that suddenly seemed to draw him to the place even more often than before. Draco knew the Slytherin common room would be non-stop party tonight as the butterbeer, fire whiskey, and spiced vodka flowed freely. It was the night before the Slytherin vs. Ravenclaw match. In the opening match, Hufflepuff had defeated Gryffindor, with Cedric Diggory catching the snitch. Then Ravenclaw had beaten Hufflepuff. Now, if Slytherin could pull off the win, they would be in the lead for the Quidditch Cup. The good thing about the Slytherin common room party was that none of his friends would find him here. And with the rift between Hermione and her friends, they were almost guaranteed peace and quiet and solitude. Still on about the magical creatures, Granger. He drawled as he approached her table one Friday evening, trying to make a Dementor into a pet. If you must know, Malfoy, I'm looking for ways to save Buckbeak. I'm working with Hagrid on his defense, she huffed. Buckbeak. Was this some kind of muggle money? The hippogriff that your father wants executed because of your injury. Her tone was slightly mocking and acidic, especially her last word. He said nothing, looking down and feeling sick to his stomach suddenly. His trial is coming up soon, and I've been researching precedence cases for Hagrid. Perhaps I can go with him to present the case, she mused. Oh. I'm not sure that's the best idea, Granger. Draco deflated. He dropped into the chair beside her. The whole hippogriff thing was out of his hands. When his father had been told of the incident, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement and the family barrister had been contacted. The wheels were put into motion. He could no sooner stop it than he could hold the Hogwarts Express back with his bare hands. Why not? Buckbeak is innocent. You provoked him into acting defensively. She took in his troubled expression and her voice softened, even if you didn't mean to. I swear, I didn't, Granger. I never expected him to rear up that way. I shouldn't have approached so directly. He looked up into her eyes pleadingly and continued. But my father can be persuasive in his arguments and forceful when his mind is made up. I am not really able to change that. Perhaps if you talked to your father one-on-one, she began. Granger. He cut inches. You don't know my father. When his mind is made up, nothing changes it. There is no fixing this, no making it better. Believe me, my father, he's dangerous. He's a very cruel. Draco did not finish the thought aloud. He pressed his lips together and screwed his eyes shut as though to banish the words. Bastard. Asshole. Possible murder. He shivered at this last one, thinking of those families, the Prewetts, the McKinnons he'd researched years before. Draco. She had turned her whole body to face him, reaching out her hand to his arm, just as she had that day in the alcove. Through the haze of fear at the thought of his father's possible treachery, he felt a wave of déjà vu. Almost like time had been turned back to that moment months before. He was being given the chance to live that moment again, and he wasn't going to foul it up this time. Without giving himself a moment to think about what he was doing, his hand reached for hers. He grabbed her fingers, pulling her towards him. Her eyes widened as the space between their faces narrowed. He stared into her coppery bronze eyes, trying to tell her everything in his mind and soul without using words. Fear him, he thought. I'm worried for you if you don't. Please don't try to challenge him at this hearing. You may be brave, but he's strong. And I might care about you. Maybe a little too much. She was the first to drop her gaze, her breath resuming in quickened sips of air as though she'd forgotten the proper way to breathe. His eyes, too, fell to their hands, where their fingers had somehow gotten intertwined in the brief span of a moment. I'm sorry, he said miserably. He wasn't sure what exactly he was apologizing for the hippogriff. His father. Holding her hand. All of it. I am too. She dropped his hand and stood up to leave, looking down, cheeks rather pink. If you're able to do anything to help, I'll try to think of something, he said lamely, his silver eyes turning gray in the lengthening night shadows. When he looked up again, she was gone. Oh. The following week, Draco brooded. On the one hand, his father and several of the older Slytherins who didn't care for Hagrid were focused on killing the hippogriff and getting Hagrid fired. On the other, Draco hated to think of how sad that would make Hermione. And him, truth be told. He sent Thorn to Hagrid's hut with a large steak for Buckbeak and a flagon of wine for Hagrid. He included a note of apology to Hagrid for the whole thing, knowing that he couldn't face going down to the hut in person. Seeing the hippogriff again would be an additional heartbreak he just wasn't prepared for. The hippogriff had acted within the norm for his species and additionally had done Draco a favor. Because of his injury, he had missed the defense against the dark arts lesson that still had most of the school buzzing. Professor Remus Lupin had introduced a boggart, the shape-shifting creature that projected a person's worst fears back to them. Draco had heard everyone's craziest fears realized, and often these discussions took place behind the person's back in a laughing manner. The fact that Marcus Flint was afraid of mice, that Seamus Finnegan feared banshees. That Daphne Greengrass thought that missing a dance step during her lessons with Madame Chanchus was the height of horror, were all the sources of greatest amusement to their classmates. Draco did not know what his worst fear would manifest as, and he was very glad that it was not broadcast for everyone in Slytherin and Gryffindor houses to learn. In his heart of hearts, he was afraid that everyone would see his father aiming his wand or his fists or a fireplace poker at him. It was a shame that both Draco and Lucius could not endure. Somehow, word had gotten around this week that Harry Potter's boggart was a Dementor. Apparently, some Ravenclaw had passed by the defense against the dark arts classroom door one evening and had spotted it through the window. The Slytherins was trying to outdo each other and coming up with ridiculous plans to scare him by dressing up as Dementors. Some thought to sneak into Gryffindor Tower and scare him on the night before the next Gryffindor Quidditch match, but no one knew the password. Some suggested doing it in the library, but Draco rightly pointed out that Potter hardly ever went to the library. One suggested luring him to the Astronomy Tower or the Forbidden Forest, but these ideas seemed needlessly complex. Finally, it was Pansy, listening to their machinations from across the Slytherin common room, who told them to keep it simple, just go and do it wherever Potter is. So it was decided to do it Saturday during the Quidditch match between Ravenclaw and Gryffindor. Next was working out the logistics, the who and the how. There was no shortage of black sheets in Slytherin dormitories, but Dementors were extremely tall. None of them could fly, and a Dementor on a broom sounded a bit silly. It was Blaise who suggested trying stilts, a skill at which it turned out Gregory Goyle was excellent. No one else was able to master it, so Draco decided to volunteer to sit on Crabbe's shoulders. It was a reckless plan, one that would earn him detention at best and expulsion at worst. But Draco saw a potential silver lining, if he was on punishment. It might distract Lucius enough that he would forget about the issue with the hippogriff. And after all, hadn't Lucius divulged his fair share of pranks and misdeeds during his time at Hogwarts? He might even be a bit proud of Draco for once. Oh, his father was not proud. Lucius's face when he came through the flue of Professor Snape's office was a livid red. The phrases "shame upon the House of Slytherin" and besmirching the name of Malfoy clanged in his head. He went to bed that night embarrassed, ashamed, and wanting to sink through his bed into the floor and not get up again. But the worst had been immediately after the Quidditch match had ended. Draco lay on the ground, dazed, a tangle of black sheets and limbs and broken stilts around him. Looking up, he'd seen the severe face of Professor McGonagall, pinched and angry, practically spitting fire. Behind her stood Hermione, who looked at him with and shed tears brimming in her eyes. As Professor McGonagall moved off to rail at Professor Snape, Hermione bent close. "How could you? I thought better of you, Malfoy. What kind of circus was all of this?" She gestured around at the chaos. "You shouldn't, Granger," he said groggily. "Don't think better of me. Better yet, don't even think of me. I shouldn't even cross your mind, mudblood." He had said it to hurt her. If he hurt her feelings now with his words, there could be no chance of her hurting his heart later. Because now, looking up at Hermione, the bleak sun peeking out from behind a cloud and lighting her beatifically from behind like some sort of Muggle religious painting, Draco knew he liked her too much. He did not yet know what love was. He was a few months shy of his 14th birthday. For Salazar's sake, love was something for adults, not teenagers like himself. But he liked her more than a little, probably had for a long time, and that was not good for her. Not good for either of them. Oh, the next few weeks were some of the roughest Draco had yet been through at Hogwarts. Lots of the girls in the school, even a few from Slytherin, had caught wind of Buckbeak's upcoming execution at the behest of Lucius Malfoy, and blamed Draco that the pretty bird thing was going to die by beheading. The mean looks and words were enough that Draco was certain he'd never get a date with any girl in the school in the near future. The Slytherin Quidditch team was pissed at him because the Dementor prank had gone so badly. He had several detentions with Professors McGonagall and Sprout, either sorting buttons and pin cushions and teacups by color and type for Transfiguration's class, or refilling flower pots for herbology with newly declumped by Draco Farmer McPoyle's magical soil, which Draco was 99% sure was just unicorn and thunderbird poop mixed together. Professor Snape was angry at him. His father was righteously pissed off. His mother was just disappointed. And Harry Potter and his merry band of arsehole Gryffindors were riding high off their win against Ravenclaw. And they were gunning for Slytherin next. That jerk Oliver Wood sneered in his face every time they'd passed each other in the corridor. Even the weasel had gotten away with a few jabs at Draco, going on about how we're going to win the cup, even though he personally had precisely zero to do with determining the winner of the Quidditch Cup. And the awful cherry on the Knickerbocker glory was this: Hermione was doing exactly what he had told her to do, apparently not thinking of him at all. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him in the slightest. When other people teased him, it was like she didn't even hear it. He had gotten exactly what he wanted, for her to leave him the hell alone. And, as precisely anyone could have predicted except him, he realized now it was nothing like what he wanted. It turned out that her ignoring him made her even more attractive to him. Where before Draco may have only had a handful of dreams about girls, nameless, faceless, vaguely sexual, he was now vividly dreaming mainly about Hermione. And in very specific ways that made it very hard to concentrate when he thought of them in inopportune moments during class. More than once, he had had to make excuses to stay behind after class and wait for his heart-on to subside after catching her sucking on a sugar quill, or sticking her tongue between her teeth while working out a difficult arithmancy problem, or pulling her hair back before beginning a complex potion. In truth, a good stiff breeze might provoke such a reaction these days in him, but with Hermione, it happened nearly every day now. Sometimes more than once a day. It had become nearly impossible to make it a full week without having to step into a restroom for a quick wank between classes. He was having to ask the house elves to change his sheets nearly every day in the dormitories. It was, to put it succinctly, altogether embarrassing. The only friends who still seemed enamored with the old Draco swagger were Vince and Greg. They had been happy to be included in the whole Quidditch prank, and Draco appreciated their unswerving followership. He made sure to play up the whole Hagrid is a stupid oaf and Buckbeak deserved to get killed around the pair of them. It was this kind of attempt to bolster his own standing that finally garnered Hermione's attention once again, but not at all in the way that he had hoped. Draco and the two Slytherins boys had been walking back to the castle from flying one day in June. Greg and Vince were laughing about Hagrid, who was upset about the hippogriff's hearing. They had stopped just inside the front doors to listen to Hagrid blow his nose in anguish, and Draco commented on the pathetic absurdity of it all. Now that he was out of Hagrid's earshot, when Hermione seemed to appear from nowhere, she rushed at Draco with the anger and force of a banshee. Before he was aware of it, she had hauled back her hand and slapped him hard right across his face. "Don't you dare call Hagrid pathetic. You value evil." Her Gryffindor cronies weakly pulled her back, looking just as shocked as Draco felt. Then she pulled out her wand, and Draco knew things were possibly about go from bad to worse. He looked up and met her eyes. Anger flashed there in the copper rings, but there was something more hurt. All of the emotions of the last few weeks seemed to hit him at once. Fear, anger, disappointment, shame, longing. He knew that he was unable to stop them as they flooded his face, then his eyes. Before the tears could fall, he muttered, "Come on," to Greg and Vince, and the three set off towards the dungeons. Along the way, the two other boys discussed brutish plots for revenge against Hermione. "We're gonna beat her and pot her up for you, Draco. Don't worry," Vince started in, pounding his meaty fists together. But Draco shut them down with finality. "No one touches her. She's mine. I'll take care of it," he said with what he hoped sounded like a threat and not like a promise. And he would. He would figure out a way to make this up to her. Somehow, someday. He hoped.